Hello and welcome back once again to Intermediate Bible Lesson Planning. This is lecture number 12. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the importance of forming good questions. Good teaching often asks really pointed and purposeful questions. And today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that and how to do that exactly. But the very first place I want to start here today with this lecture is to remind you that Jesus, who is often referred to as the good teacher or rabbi, was known for asking pointed, purposeful questions all throughout his ministry. And one thing that you need to understand about Jesus's questions is that there were different categories and different reasons as to why he asked those who were following him, those who he challenged or disagreed with. There's a reason why he used different types of questions. The first category of questions that Jesus used were questions about faith. And you see this all throughout his ministry. Questions like, who do you say that I am? Remember when he got his disciples alone and he was asking them the questions about, who do people say that I am? And so they're all giving answers. You know, some say you're John the Baptist, yada, yada. But then he cuts to the heart of the matter and he gets to the point and he's like, but who do you say that I am? And there's a reason why Jesus was asking that question. It was to prompt a response of faith within his followers. Second question that I want to bring to your attention is found in Matthew chapter 9, verse 28. If you remember, there were two blind men that came and followed Jesus, and they wanted to be healed. They wanted to receive and have their sight restored. And Jesus asked them a seems very obvious question, but I think a very important question too. He said, do you believe that I am able to do this? And the reason that Jesus is asking these questions is because he wanted those blind men to realize that they needed to have faith in what it was that he was getting ready to do. And so he asks the question, do you believe that I'm able to do this? And of course, we know how that ends up, and he makes them see. He opens their eyes. Third question that he asks of his disciples, in Luke chapter 8, verse 25, he says, where's your faith? Or as it's listed in one of the other Gospels, he says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? The context of this story is when Jesus commands his disciples to get into a boat and they're sailing across the sea. Jesus is in the back of the boat with his feet kicked up and he's taking a siesta, he's taking a nap, and a storm is coming upon them. They're waking up. Wake up, we're about to die. Don't you care? We're going to perish. And Jesus just gets up and he's like, hey, storm be still, wind be still, waves be still. And he asks his disciples, where is your faith? Do you think I really called you on this life journey to follow me so that you could end up dead in the Sea of Galilee? Where's your faith? Do you not believe who I am, that I am God in the flesh? Where is your faith? John chapter 5, as we get to John's gospel, an interesting question is asked in John chapter 5, verse 6, about the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. It says that he was lame and that he was unable to walk, and he sat by this pool because they believed an angel stirred up the waters, and if the first person that got into the waters would be made well. And Jesus asks a very pointed question that almost seems a little offensive, right? But he leans into that uncomfortable feeling and he just says, look, do you even want to be made well? And, it causes an introspective kind of gut check within this man that he has to answer realistically and truthfully. Do you even want to be made well? And then, of course, we have in John chapter 21, we have Peter's restoration after he denies Christ 3 times during his arrest and during his trials. And he asks the same question of Peter 3 different times. And he says, Peter, do you love me? And there again, this was a question about faith, about relationship. Do you love me? You denied me, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so, Peter, I'm asking you this question. This question is for you. I want you to study it. I want to hear from you. I want to know your heart. Do you love me? And in John chapter 6, verse 67, Jesus asks his disciples, let me give you the context there. In the previous verses, Jesus had just gotten done feeding the multitudes. There was a crowd that was there. They wanted the loaves. They wanted the fish. And then Jesus begins teaching them. And he said some kind of controversial stuff. And he's telling them that, look, you need to eat my flesh and you need to drink my blood. And they were all like, what is this? We didn't sign up for cannibalism. Of course, that's not what Jesus was talking about. But that was what the multitudes who were kind of on the outskirts believed. And so many of those who were following him at the time decided to leave. Like, look, I'm out. This is weird. I'm out. And so Jesus asks his disciples the question in verse 67 and asks them, will you also go away? Are you going to treat me like all the others have treated me and just abandon me? And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. Where else would we go? So the first category of questions that Jesus asks are questions about faith and relationship. And there's more than just those 6 that I've listed. As a matter of fact, some scholars have pointed out that Jesus, during the course of his ministry, asked upwards of over 300 questions. We're not covering all 300 questions of Jesus's questions that he asked. But I would encourage you to, as you read the Gospels, maybe underline and circle or highlight some of the questions that Jesus asked. Because keep this in mind, Jesus was more than just a good teacher. He was God. And because he is God, he knows everything. He's omniscient, and he does not need to put a question mark at the end of any of his sentences. He never needs to ask a question because he knows the answer to all questions. But it's still interesting that Jesus uses questions throughout his ministry for a purpose and a pointed response. Second category of questions that Jesus is found using throughout his ministry are questions that convict but also challenge. Questions like found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 46, the Sermon on the Mount. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? In other words, he's like, good for you for loving the people who are easy to love. But what about the people who are difficult to love? This was a question that was meant to create an inward evaluation and then a response, not a verbal response necessarily, but a decision to change. Second question in Matthew 16, verse 26, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? And that is exactly what Jesus was curious about. He wanted his followers to see the big picture, to see that there was more at stake, there was more on the line than just the immediate future, that there was an entire eternity to live for. This was a convicting question that was also meant to challenge his disciples. Matthew chapter 7, verse 3, again in the Sermon on the Mount, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a log hanging out of your own eye, right? This was meant to convict and challenge, that it's so easy for us to see the flaws and the sins of others when we ourselves have so many sins that we're lugging around and carrying ourselves. And then he has a challenging question to the Pharisees who were so critical of Jesus' ministry. Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Remember, there was a question that the religious leaders had to Jesus concerning the Sabbath, not on just one occasion, but several occasions. And so Jesus often asked questions to kind of push back, to convict, and to challenge, and to elicit a change. That is the master teacher. That is the master rabbi, if you will. Well, Jesus's questions, if you think about the questions that he asked, I just want to kind of give an overview of some of his questions that he asked. Jesus's questions revealed belief or unbelief. It kind of separated the two. It separated them into two different categories. Are you a believer? Are you a follower of me? Or are you not a follower of me? That was the reason why he asked a lot of questions. It also drew out confession. You know, he wanted to know who was willing to admit and confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord of all. But it also forced self-examination. And that's what we've been talking about too. And so as a teacher, I feel like it's really important for you to ask questions that will force self-examination. And we're going to explore that here in just a second. But it also exposed hypocrisy, you know. Again, it divided and gave a reality gut check to those who might otherwise just be giving the Sunday school answer when really their mouth might be saying one thing, but their lives were definitely proclaiming something different. But also, and most importantly, Jesus's questions invited relationship. Jesus himself infamously extended the invitation and said that whoever is weary and heavy burdened, come to me and I will give you rest. This was an invitation for anybody who would seek to follow him. And that was what he really wanted. But he wanted people to take their relationship with him very seriously. And I think as a good teacher, I think that's what we want for our students as well. We want to kind of encourage a good relationship to be had with Jesus Christ. So let's move on to the second part of today's lecture, making questions that matter. As you are a teacher, you will soon and quickly realize that there's a big difference between a good question and a poor question. And I just want to kind of help you think through a little bit about what makes a good question for your students. There are six total things we're going to kind of cover here today. There's going to be four things to do. Four things not to do, and then four things to do. Okay? But first, let's talk about something to do. And the first thing that you have to do, if you want to get your group comfortable with discussion, with answering questions out loud, you need to get the group comfortable with one another. And this is done through a wide variety of methods. But you need to get the group comfortable with one another so they're willing and able to speak out loud. And so if you're in a youth group setting, this can be done through an ice-breaking game, you know, kind of a get-to-know-you game, something that they feel more comfortable with one another. If you're in a small group setting, it can be simply asking the group for prayer requests. This is not only a purposeful thing to get the group together to pray, but it's also just a way to get people talking and to be comfortable with breaking silence and things of that nature. In our Sunday school class that I am a part of on Sunday mornings, I don't lead the class, but one thing that the teacher does that is so instrumental in getting the group comfortable with each other, even though it's essentially the same group that meets week after week. But one thing that the teacher does is he just gets them to small talk. Hey, how was your week this week? Anything happen this week? Get them small talking about the weather, about a sports game, about anything that has happened to them at work or in the family or anything notable in the news. And then you'll see that they're more willing to talk about the questions that you're going to have within your lesson. So now let's get to some of the don'ts. First of all, if you want to make good questions, you've got to make sure that you don't make the questions too easy. These are known as softball questions or Sunday school answer questions. You know, if you're like, who does the Bible say that Jesus is? He's God. If the questions are too easy, people are going to be hesitant to want to answer those questions because it's like, is this a rhetorical question? Is this a question that doesn't require an audible response? So you need to make sure that the questions are not too easy. But also, on the opposite side of that, don't make the questions too difficult. If the questions are too difficult, if there's a potential for somebody to answer and and they're going to be wrong and be embarrassed by that, you're going to find that your students will shut down and not answer the questions that are too difficult either. Not everybody in your Sunday school class is going to be like Simon Peter. Simon Peter was quick to answer, but slow sometimes to let the filter of his brain filter out the words that shouldn't be said. And so not everybody in your class is going to be like Simon Peter. So don't make the questions too difficult, or else that will cause the students to shut down as well. Fourth thing not to do, don't make the questions too personal. What do I mean by this? Well, if you're having a discussion, let's say on sin, don't ask the question, what are some sins that you struggle with? Nobody wants to divulge in a group setting the sins that are private, that, we're oftentimes embarrassed by our sin, and those things are not on for public display. And so unless the group knows each other very, very well and intimately, this is a question that people are going to avoid. So instead of making it personal like that, what sins do you struggle with? Make it more generic, more comfortable. What are some sins that Christians struggle with? That's a more generic and more general question that will elicit discussion. Now let's finish with 2 things to do with your questions. First of all, do make questions that create discussion. Do create questions that cause people to think and to answer. Now, one way that I like to do this, especially if we're studying a text, is, why do you think God asked or taught on this particular subject? That's a great way to get people to think that there's a reason why this is recorded in Scripture. Another question that could be asked that would, I think, create discussion is, what do you think, in your own words, God is trying to say in this text? It causes people to back up and to evaluate what it is we're studying and restate it in their own words. And that creates some discussion as well. And the last thing that I would tell you to do is to do make questions that cause your students to make a decision. Ask questions like, and it doesn't need to be an audible discussion question, but as you're winding down the lesson, maybe you could say, what are some ways that you need to do better at following Jesus this week? What are some temptations in your life that you need to say no to more frequently? These are questions that are designed to make a decision within them. And I feel like those questions, those types of questions, are what we're really after as we are trying to teach lessons. I want to wrap up our discussion, our lecture here today, with some final practical guidelines for using questions. First thing that I would tell you to do as a teacher is to ask fewer questions, but better ones. I've sat in some classes where it almost became a nervous habit for a teacher to say, ask a question that was a rhetorical question that didn't need a response. He was just asking a question to kind of make a transition to the next statement. And because of that, when they asked questions, nobody answered those questions in the future, because we weren't sure if it was like, well, is this another rhetorical question that you're just going to move on or what? And that leads me to this, that when you ask a question, and this is hard for me, I had to learn it, but when you ask a question, allow time for silence. It's okay. Let the heaviness of that question just kind of linger until someone answers. Oftentimes, we're so quick to give a response that, when we ask a question, we don't even wait 5 seconds because it's too awkward. If you allow silence, that's good, because that usually means that people are thinking about it. And that leads me to say this: do not answer your own question too quickly. If you're asking a question, don't spoon feed the answers. Really get your students to think about it and question it on their own. Fourthly, affirm the effort. Now, this is important. Affirm the effort. when answers need refinement. So if you have somebody who is thinking about the questions, maybe one thing, and they offer an answer that's maybe not exactly what you're looking for, find a way to simply say, hey, that is a great response, and kind of elaborate on that a little bit. But end it by saying, but that's not quite what I was thinking when I asked this question. And then fifthly, redirect discussions back to the text if the answers seem to drift, because this is going to happen in lessons. You're going to find that when you're asking questions, when people are discussing these questions, you're going to see that the discussion often kind of lingers in areas and in ways that you didn't anticipate. And so you may need to redirect the discussion back to the text that you're studying when it drifts away from the point what you're trying to make. And then finally, number 6, avoid yes or no questions unless used strategically. Because if it's just a yes or no question, that provides no discussion. It's usually not all that helpful. The answers are usually obvious if it's a yes or no question, okay? So you may need to be very strategic with that question. And then finally, and I think this is really important, if this is a lesson that we're wanting our students to learn and we're wanting them to gain some information by, and we're seeking some change from them, give time for your students to ask questions of you. Like maybe say, is there anything that you didn't understand? Anything that maybe you disagree with? Anything that maybe we want to discuss further? This is really used, I think, to help students really truly have life transformation as a result of the lesson that you've taught. Well, that wraps it up for this week's lecture. Thank you guys for watching. Again, if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to try to answer those questions to the best of my ability. Have a great week, and we'll see you online meeting.